All right, this is our final set of lectures for this course in European history. What we're going to do is we're going to cover the topic of globalization, terror, and technology. Much of this material really kind of covers the last, I would say, 40 years of Western Civ. Uh, what we can say about globalization, terror, and technology is that after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there were a lot of significant shifts that were taking place that led to this fall and, in some ways, the end of communistic hegemony uh, in certain parts of the world and the triumphal circumstances in which capitalism reigned. It's not to say that socialism itself is dead. In fact, I think there is a unique tension that exists between capitalistic values and socialistic values that has been in some way maintained. And I think Britain is one of the Western civilization countries that demonstrates this unique dance and tension between capitalistic values and certain levels of acceptability within socialism, particularly in the areas of education, healthcare, providing for the vulnerable, in taking care of socioeconomic disparity, which oftentimes the socioeconomic disparity is part of the unwelcomed fruit of a capitalistic society. It might be best described as the socioeconomic disparity is the thorns to the rose that comes from capitalism. Well, so during this last 30 to 40 years, you have a globalization that is starting to take place. And there are some particular markers that led to this globalization. You could actually say this entire course has been the slow evolution of a globalized uh, planet. The from the very beginnings of exploration across the Atlantic, the whole transatlantic phenomenon is these first steps towards globalization. And so transportation is a big aspect of the markers of globalization, the ability to fly around the globe or to cruise and freight shipping items around the globe. And so it's not just being able to travel for business, but to be able to export and import goods around the world and to have a global commerce take place. Hospitality and service that becomes globalized. What I mean by that isn't that the fact that I can go to any restaurant in the world and enjoy a meal, but I can go to any country in the world and enjoy a McDonald's meal. There are global hospitality corporations that create a globalized culture. Not only that, but uh, restaurants that have a certain level of influence from their native country are then being able to be franchised into other nations. And so you have a place like Nando's Peri Peri in Oak Park, and yet Nando's Peri Peri is a Portuguese fusion between South African and Brazilian style foods, and Portugal too. It's this fusion that takes place in foods. So there's a globalization of corporations. You have global recognition of Nike. You have global recognition of Under Armour. We have global values of health and fitness. We have global telecommunication capabilities. The internet has created the possibility for us to connect to one another through screens, through internet, through email, in order to do business. It's not just the letter correspondence that we had in the transatlantic world, which in some ways started to create a global communication network, but there is a very quick way for me to tweet something through Twitter and to have somebody in South America or Asia be able to respond and participate in the exact same conversation that I am a part of. And likewise, news is able to spread globally quite quickly. So when a global event takes place, news about it spreads across the world. I think you should expect me to talk about COVID-19. COVID-19 is a global phenomenon. And if it hadn't been for the fact that we created all of these opportunities to export this infection, this viral infection across the world, it might have been contained in a specific geopolitical region. But because of our globalization, this pandemic has been able to reach America, has spread throughout America, and is changing the way in which the global society functions. We are globally wearing face masks in order to demonstrate a sense of virtue of the fact that we want to protect the vulnerable and we want to protect others from one another and the possible asymptomatic spread of the sickness. So you can see these different globalization markers come into existence. One might say that there's a global sport. A lot of you in this class would probably think I'm assuming about the Super Bowl because it is a very well-watched event. But when I think about a global sport, I'm talking about football. I'm talking about soccer. I'm talking about how the World Cup unites the world every single 4 years in a global event. Also, the Olympics. Every 2 years, we have a winter, and then 2 years later, we have a summer Olympics. Globalized sports and the competition between nations creates a global atmosphere of connection that takes place. And then entertainment. There's Bollywood, there's Hollywood, but there's movies in the foreign market too that become well known throughout the world. But there's global franchises. Everybody knows what James Bond is. People are familiar with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and people are very familiar with Star Wars, globally speaking. And so there's a global sense to entertainment. The key components that make up a globalization, which is one way to think about globalization, in which the whole world is being localized in some sort of way, and you have a local connection to other local connections throughout the world. There are some key components to this. There's the economics of it, there's the ecology of it. We have to steward this globe ecologically as we globalize. And so we're trying to create cleaner ways of using energy, using water energy, using solar energy, having less of an impact on the global environment because of global pollution through factory goods. In fact, we have with globalization particular areas of the globe that master particular industries. It's kind of like Hunger Games, in which there are different districts that produce different commodities. But in Asia, we have the global manufacturer of everyday commodity and goods, whether it's a Happy Meal toy or if it's a t-shirt. But then you have the telecommunications industry, and you have nations like Sweden and America and Japan that produce information technologies for the rest of the world. And then you also have aeronautical leaders and mechanical leaders like Germany and America as well that are producing aviation and vehicles. We have different industry leaders for these type of goods. So this kind of gives you just a general rundown of what globalization is. What I'm going to do with the rest of this lecture is I'm going to briefly step into talking about two major aspects that we could say as being significant tropes of the last 30 years. Those are the tropes of terror and the trope of technology. And so over the 1980s through the 2000s, we see these various developments. We see global technology developments that have to do with the gaming industry, with the internet, with the smartphone. Then we also have a global sense of terror taking place, of people feeling threatened, whether it has to do with shootings in schools or if it has to do with mass terror events that are functionally acts of war. And so we're going to cover more of those kind of events. And then also, along with terror, there is events that have terrible effects upon society. And I would say that in 2019 and 2020, we had two significant terrible events that aren't necessarily acts of terror, but they are acts that had a global impact on the psychology of humanity. And so we'll get to talking about that in the next lectures.